So I don't know if you can tell, but I got the slide wrong. You mind turning me down just a little bit? We're not singing again. Y'all definitely don't want me singing. So, all right. But anyways, let me get to. I usually put a welcome little slide there, and then go into it. We'll go straight into it today. I just want to thank everyone who prayed for us as we traveled to Destin and back. We had a good little trip, good getaway. That's the only time we've gone to the beach this year, isn't it? So I know that's not a good thing for Helen. Helen loves going to the beach, so we got to make sure we get down there a few more times. But we're in this series that we started 2 weeks ago. I took a pause last week to step on my own toes and with just current events, but we're going to continue this. And so this second week, and the idea of here is to forget religion and to find Christ. Right? Is the idea behind this series that we're doing. And so this week's lesson is that, there are no outcasts with Jesus. There's no outcast that when it comes to the family of God and when it comes to Christ. Anyone in here ever been felt like an outcast or an outsider? Or definitely me. If anyone of you have heard my stories of me growing up, I was awkward. I still am. Helen's going to be like, oh, you still are. But even more awkward than I am now. And I hadn't quite learned how to, I don't want to say mask my awkwardness as much, maybe. So I was extremely weird as a kid. And I couldn't pick up on social cues a lot of times and would say weird things. And I still do. But I try not to do it as much. But so you kind of felt like, especially as a kid growing up, and we moved a lot. So we went from, we moved from Augusta to Kansas, and then from Kansas to West Virginia. And so I was the new kid a lot, and so that didn't help. And so I know what it's like to kind of feel like the outcast. And the problem with religion versus Christianity is religion often decides who's kind of in and who's out. Right? Who's the in crowd and who's the out crowd? But Jesus doesn't play by that. Right? Jesus doesn't have those type of rules. He doesn't say, "Oh, well, you're the cool kid, so you can be part of us, but you over there, well, but we do that, right? We do that a lot in religion. We'll be like, "Well, you can't be like that and be part of our group." Now I'm not condoning sinful behavior and stuff like that, but a lot of times we'll be like, well, you've got to become like a certain type of person before you can come here or before you can belong here. And that's not how Christ worked. And we're going to look at that today. If y'all haven't guessed, this is I kind of hesitated to use this slide because for anyone who's into horror movies, right, it looks like the well from the Ring, right? Is it The Ring? Yeah. And so anyways, I wanted to use it. This was the woman at the well, and this was the best kind of thing. And I thought it would be a good talking piece. I figured some people would get that. But today's lesson is going to come from the woman at the well, right? Jesus' interaction, one of his first kind of ministry aspects that we see early on in his ministry. And so the first thing, we're going to look at a couple things that Jesus does, and because there's no outcast with Jesus, we're going to look at some of the things that Jesus does for us. The first one is that he crosses barriers. Oh my goodness. Y'all, I'm sorry. You were supposed to remind, I'm blaming Helen, it's Helen's fault. No. Pass those out. I always forget to do that. I need to just hand them out when everyone comes in, so I don't forget. But the first thing that we're going to see here as we go through this is that Jesus crosses barriers. And here's pens for anyone who needs them. And so we're going to be coming from John 4 today. John 4, I think it's going to be like verses 3 through 26 or through 29. And we'll hit some of this as we go through it. But John 4, this first part where we talk about Jesus crossing barriers, right? In John 4, verses 3 through 9, it says, "So he left Judea and returned to Galilee." And he said, the John was writing this, said he had to go through Samaria on the way. Well, that's actually counterintuitive to what most people would have done in that day, especially Jews. If you said, hey, I have to go through Samaria, they would have said, you're crazy. Why would you go through there? Because they hated the Samaritans. And so I'm going to skip forward. I don't know how many of y'all can see this. And see this. So this area through here is from Galilee, where Jesus was, to Judea, where he was going to. And this red line goes all the way around Samaria. They actually built a road to go all the way. We're going to have to work on that. To go all the way around Samaria. You can see that. So to Jesus, this is the more than likely the route that he took was this green line that he went through. And so most people in who were Jews in that time, if they were in Galilee, they would take this road, and this little river where right beside the road was the border for Samaria. They made sure they went all the way out, went around their country, and then came back in, so they wouldn't even step foot in their borders. That's how much they hated. That's how much the Jews hated the Samaritans. And so we can see this green line, which was more than likely the path that Jesus took. And so tradition in that day says, okay, he would have taken the red road around because Jews didn't go through Samaria. And so when we see that, right, in verse 3 and 4, where he says he had to go through Samaria, in the way he did, he had a mission. There was a reason he was going through Samaria, and that's what we're going to look at today. It says eventually, in verse 5, he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. This would have been the hottest part of the day. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, so now this is another thing we need to pay attention to here. Jesus spoke to her. Right? One, she was a woman. Two, she was a Samaritan woman, and Jesus was a Jew. Right? In most circumstances, like he wouldn't have even recognized that she was there. He wouldn't have even given her the time today. But the fact that he talked to her shows a lot about who Jesus was and how he welcomed outcasts. And so that's one of the things that we're going to look at today. And he says, please give me a drink. And she kind of calls him out. We're going to look at that. He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. She said to Jesus, you are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? And so we see here that Jesus is asking her for a drink because Jesus crosses barriers. Like I said, in that day, Jews would avoid Samaritans. They wouldn't even talk to them. They would spit on the ground in front of them. They would have nothing to do with them. They considered them lower than dogs. Go ahead. They were a mix. So the Samaritans were a mix of the Jews and the I can't remember the particular race, the Gentiles. And so they were considered half breeds, half Jewish people, and so they weren't welcome in the Jewish areas, right, around the temple and in that area. So they kind of had set up their own little country of Samaria. That's where the Samaritan people. And so they were considered to them they were considered half breeds, and so they were half Jewish, half Gentile. I can't remember exactly what the Gentile race was that had conquered them. So when they came back, they weren't welcome around Jerusalem. And so, so not only did, the Jews avoid the Samaritans, the men didn't talk to women in public at that time. So there's two things that Jesus is doing that goes way around or way out of the way of the common norms of that day. And so he spoke to her. And so I love that, the start of this, he says, I have to go to Samaria. I have to go this way. He didn't have to. I mean, he had a choice. He knew what he was doing. And his purpose was, as he kicked off his ministry, was it's an interesting aspect was to kick it off through Samaria. And so we're going to look at some of the aspects of that. And so he treats her with dignity and with respect. And this was someone else that others would have ignored. And so I want us to think about that real quick. Think of groups of people today that the religious circles will avoid. Who does the religious in the United States today? Who will they avoid? Who will they not have anything to do with? Anyone who don't believe like them, right? Right? And that's honestly become part of the problem with the church today. Is we've become a group of inner circles of bubble of just Christians, right? And we've taught this idea, this religious idea of, well, you shouldn't have anything to do with the world. You shouldn't have any friends that are in the world. You shouldn't have all these things. And so Christians only hang out with Christians and only are around Christians and only have anything to do with Christians. Well, how in the world are we going to convert anyone if we don't actually interact? But unfortunately, sometimes that's the case. And it's like we do like this, the Jews did with the Samaritans. It's like, oh, well, you're not a Christian, so stay away from me. And that's not how Jesus was, and so that's what we see with his ministry. And so we can't do that. And we see that a lot of times. You know, we've talked about this, and I think I've mentioned this before, right? Even in this church, before it was finished being founded, or however it was founded, whatever, like there were only certain types of people who were welcome in this church building. And if you weren't that particular type of person, you had to sit back there. And so again, and there's still some churches that are like that today. And again, that's religion. That's not Christianity. Christianity welcomes everyone, no matter what you look like, no matter what you believe, no matter a lot of things. You're welcome. Right now, we're going to look at that. There's a time you're welcome, but there's also you come to change. You come to become better, and that's what Jesus is going to pursue, and we're going to see that. And so following Jesus means that we're going to have to learn to cross cultural and racial and social barriers to share his love. We've got to cross those barriers. We got to cross those areas where it's like, oh, well, you don't have anything. You shouldn't go. You shouldn't hang out with these people, or you shouldn't have anything to do with these people. No. Jesus, that's what the Pharisees told Jesus. The Pharisees told Jesus, you shouldn't talk to these people. You shouldn't eat with these people. You shouldn't hang out with these people. He's like, nah, I know what I'm doing. And so not only does Jesus cross barriers, Jesus meets us in our brokenness. Right? I think a lot of times the church, we get in trouble or we mess up because we think people, well, you need to get things together before you come and be part of the church, right? You're going to come hang out with us, you need to get it all together first before you're allowed to come hang out with us. And Jesus didn't do that. So in John 4, verses 10 through 18, when we continue this story, we see that Jesus replied, he says, if only you knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me and I would give you living water. She's like, kind of like, I can see an eye roll with this response. She's like, but sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket, all right? And this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? She's like, where in the world? What are you talking about? And then she continues on, and besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob? She had no clue who she was talking to. She's about to find out. Who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed? Jesus replied, anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. But anyone who drinks the water I give you will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Now, she didn't understand what he was talking about here. She was thinking physical. He was talking spiritual. But he's using this as a teaching moment for her. And so, of course, she responds like anyone would. She said, please, sir, the woman said, give me this water, then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water. This was coming to get that water was a task. One, she was an outcast. And this is the thing we got to realize, too, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Not only was she an outcast because she was a Samaritan and because she was a woman, right, to the culture, she was an outcast in her own society. And that's why the women would come to the well during the morning or the evening time, whenever it was coolest, and they would come in a group for protection. Right? Here she is by herself in the middle of the day because no one wants to be around her. She's an outcast. But here it is, Jesus offering her and talking to her in the middle of the day. And so that's why she's at noon coming there. So Jesus, knowing what he's going to do here, says, well, go and get your husband, Jesus told her. I don't have a husband, the woman replied. Jesus said, you're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth. And so he calls her out on her, I would say calls her out, but he addresses her truth, right? She did say that I don't have a husband. She wasn't lying. She didn't. But Jesus goes even further into this. Okay, yeah, I know you don't have a husband, and I know you've had 5 husbands, right? Even in today's society, that's a lot. and we don't think, and looking at the context of this because of where she was and the fact that she was getting water at noon and she was an outcast among the Samaritans, I don't think all 5 of the husbands had died. And if they had, they probably need to be looking on how they died, because more than likely she would have killed him if that were the case. But more than likely what it is whatever the context was in that day, is she'd been married 5 times and divorced 5 times. And then even in that society, that was a whole lot, because even the Samaritan people tried to follow the law and the Jew, what we see, the Jewish covenants and stuff like that. So even then that was a lot. And so for whatever reason, either she left her husbands or her husbands got rid of her. For whatever reason, she had been through 5 husbands and was living with the 6th guy at this point. And so even in today's society, someone like that would be considered an outcast, right? Especially among the religious people. They would see that and be like, well, they'd come up with all kind of fun rules and things of what she'd have to do to get right. And, I won't go into the details of that. But again, we see Jesus and we see it's like, well, Jesus is being kind of harsh for calling her out. No, he's telling her the truth. He's letting her know that he knows about her. He knows who she is. And even though she is this way, he's meeting her in her brokenness. This is her issue. This is the thing that she's struggled with. Her past was messy. Who's not, right? Who in here doesn't have a messy past? None of us. She'd had 5 husbands, and she's now living with another man. Religion would condemn her. But Christ didn't. If you actually see her, he doesn't condemn her. He doesn't call her out and say anything to her about how horrible of a person she is, or how could you live like this, or, any of that kind of things. He doesn't come down on her. He just says, yes, that's true. All he does is offer her a living water. So he names her truth without shaming her. And I think that us as Christians, honestly, we're human. Jesus was perfect at it. But that is something we've got to get better at. We've got to learn how to do, is to talk to someone about their brokenness, about the thing that they're struggling with, without shaming them. Right? We're not perfect. None of us are perfect. None of us are going to live a perfect life. And so when we see someone out there and we're trying to bring them to Christ, if I walk up to them or I have a conversation with them and I, condemn them to hell because of what they're doing, well, I'm not going to get anywhere. If Jesus would have walked up to that woman and said, you're obviously some kind of, whatever, and you can't stay with a man, what kind of person are you? You're going to hell. Do you think Jesus would have gotten anywhere with her? But too often, especially in the religious world, that's our approach. We think we can shame people into coming to Christ. And at no time do you ever see Jesus speak to anyone where he shames them to try to come to him. Now, he was very honest and hard with the Pharisees, with the religious people. He was hard on them. But anytime, he never tried to shame anyone who was coming to him or looking for him, or who was outside of him, who weren't the religious people. And so Jesus doesn't wait for people to fix their lives. He meets them right where they are. He meets us right where we are. And so we don't have to get it all together. As I always say, like, anyone is welcome here. You don't have to have your life together to come and worship with us, right? To be part of Christ. Because Christ didn't expect that from anyone. And so the church shouldn't expect that to anyone. And every single one of us in here are still broken people, still trying to put our lives together, still trying to live the best life that we can. right, and follow Jesus at the same time. And I've always said the only difference between us who are in Christ and those outside of Christ is the only difference is we found Christ. That's the only difference if we've committed our Christ. We still struggle with the same things. We still have the same problems in our lives. The only thing is we have Jesus to rely on and to be there for us. And so we see then that not only does Jesus cross barriers, he meets us in our brokenness, and then he redefines worship. And you're like, well, what does this have to do with, meeting outcasts? Well, back in this day, the way they worship, right, there were some very particular things they had to do, and there were very particular places you had to worship, and there were particular things you had to do in that worship, or you weren't truly worshiping. Does that sound familiar? Right? Unless you're in a building or you do particular things, or that was the way it was back then. That was the religion back then. And so he continues on, and this is a little bit longer. So after he tells her this, she goes, "Sir," the woman said, "you must be a prophet," right? Because he's telling her things like, "This is a stranger. How does he know these things about me?" So she says, she's like, "You must be a prophet." So now she's like, "I'm going to ask the religious question," right? And this happens a lot. I don't know if anyone who's done this, right, or been talking to someone about Jesus, like, "Okay, I see your question. Let me ask you this question." And so she says, "So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount," I'm going to try to pronounce that, Gerizim, I think is how you say that, "where our ancestors worshipped?" Jesus replied, he didn't even really answer her question. And this is a lot of times, I love this. If you actually pay attention when you read the New Testament, or especially the Gospels, anytime someone asks Jesus a question, very few times did he actually directly answer the question. Most of the time he would answer the question with a question, but here he just sidesteps it and goes straight to the point. He says, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews." But he says, "But the time is coming indeed, it is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him this way, for God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." Now, what Jesus is saying here is basically a time's coming. He says that, right? It's not going to matter where you worship Jesus, on the mountain or in Jerusalem. In that day, to the Jews, if you didn't worship Jesus in Jerusalem at the temple, then you couldn't worship God, at the temple in Jerusalem, then you weren't worshiping God. And so sometimes I think we've set this up. It's like, well, unless you, at the church building, right, between this particular time and say and do these particular things a certain way, then you're not really worshiping God. And Jesus is telling her, look, and he starts his ministry off this way. He kicks his ministry off this way, saying, look, it's not going to matter where you worship God. You're going to worship God from here, from your heart, all right? And he talks about it being in spirit and in truth. And the spirit is the Holy Spirit, right? And the truth part is not, I've seen it talked about some way, that the truth part is, well, the truth part is the particular acts of worship, is those have to be done in truth. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the fact that he is truth. So you're going to worship God in spirit through the Holy Spirit, and you're going to be worshiping Jesus, and that's the truth. He is the truth. And so that's what our worship is to look like. Now, that doesn't mean, we've talked about this before, it doesn't mean we shouldn't gather together and worship like this, right? Worship looked like a lot of different things in the early church, like we talked about, but like we started out. A lot of it was in their homes. We saw that they sang songs, they prayed, they had people speak. And so God doesn't give us an outline. If you look at the Old Testament, he gives them an outline, verbatim, exactly how they are to worship. The things they're to say, the things they're to do, exactly how they're to do. I mean, it was very, very ceremonious. I mean, it had to be done all these ways. And if it wasn't done a particular way, then a lot of times the priest who was doing it would die. Luckily, we don't have to worship that way anymore. Now, some of us, we may not make it. I mess up here preaching, fall over, right? And so luckily we don't have to worry about that anymore. If you actually look, we're given very few. Well, Evelyn thought that was funny. I think she pictured me killing over. Oh, but we're actually given very few details into what our worship should look like, right? The biggest thing is that it should be holy and in order. That's kind of the biggest things that we see, right? When Paul writes to the Corinthian church, their worship was chaos. It was absolute chaos, and so he gets onto that. But we see that there's certain elements that we see are either commanded or done, but that's kind of the depth that it goes. He doesn't say, well, you have to sing these songs or this type of song or this type of music or this. He doesn't get into that. He doesn't get into what the preaching or the teaching should look like, just that it should be the truth. And so that's what he's saying. And so our worship then becomes less of a thing that we do from outside, right, of appearance as a physical thing, and it becomes more of what we're doing in our hearts, what we're doing internally. That's what our worship becomes, and then we can worship God 7 days of the week, all the time. And so that's what he's getting at there when he talks about what the worship should look like. He didn't go into the details, and a lot of times this is where we get caught up in, from a religious standpoint. Well, we'll want to argue who's right here, right? He didn't even. He's like, I'm not even getting into that. He's like, that doesn't matter. This is what matters. And this is that needs to be our approach sometimes, because too often we'll get caught in the weeds of things and be like, oh, well, we need to argue about this, or, well, we're right about this and you're wrong and we need to prove you wrong. It's like, no, those things don't matter. God's not going to ask us about that stuff when we get to heaven. And so we need to make sure that we don't get caught up in it. And so Jesus redefines worship. And so Jesus is saying it's not about a place. It's about doing it in spirit. It's about doing it in truth. Religion limits worship to a building or a ritual, and Jesus opens worship to a relationship. Go ahead, Kyle. Yeah. Yeah. I think we should look at church as an opportunity. There's multiple things, and this is why when Paul writes about not forsaking the assembly, right? Now we take it and put it in our modern context. Well, he meant every time the church doors are open, then you have to be there, right? We kind of, and that's not what Paul was saying. Was, look, some of you are claiming to be Christians, but you're not you're not coming with us and coming and worshiping together or assembling with us, period, when we come together, right? And so typically when they would come together and worship, and they're like, every time they gathered in their home, it didn't look like a worship service like we do every single Sunday. They may have had prayer. They may have just come together to pray. They may have just come together to sing, right? They may have just come together but we do see in Acts that they were on a regular basis coming together throughout the week too. And so, to get back to what you were saying, and so we've kind of messed that up to the point of thinking, well, worship is only sometimes this time period between 9 and noon and 6 and 8, right? And that's our worship, and that's what Paul was talking about when he said don't forsake the assembly, and that's not what, and that's part of it. That's part of it, because what that Sunday gathering, let me put just the Sunday gathering side of it, right? There's a lot of things to that. One, it's good for us to heal. I think it helps us, right? It helps us when we get around, like if we've had a bad week, to be around other Christians to help lift each other up, right? It helps convict us. I think church or worship, there needs to be, not always, but I think there needs to be some time, a time of conviction in that, right? I don't think that, and I hope that I don't do this, but every Sunday shouldn't come and be a pep talk and well, let me affirm you and make you feel better every Sunday, right? Now, there's some time for that. I don't think there's anything wrong with lessons that are say, hey, let's lift each other up, right? I think, do that. Like last Sunday, my lesson last Sunday was I'm going to stomp hard on Chad's toes, and I'm probably going to step on your toes while I'm doing it, and I think we need that. I think we need correction. And I think that's what a lot of the coming together is as well. And so there's both sides to that. Yep. To partake. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And so that again, yeah, that was and then that would have been the biggest thing too that we see was to worship God in remembering who He was. And that's and their communion looked much different than what ours does. If you remember, we studied a while back the early church worship and what it would have looked like, and they actually would have. What they did was they had their like worship service, and then they dismissed the non-Christians, and then the Christians would partake of what they called the love feast, which was much longer of a period, and then eventually kind of warped into or switched into being a whole meal, which we see in the First Corinthian church where they were getting drunk there. And so that's where Paul, got onto them for being disorderly and stuff like that. And so, yeah, and so there's a lot of different aspects, but I do agree with Adam. This would have been the most important reason for them to come, was to remember Christ and for what He did. But then the other aspect was the community aspect of it. I mean, it's good for Christians to be around other Christians and lift each other up. And then there was the conviction, I think, side of it. I mean, just remembering this should be a conviction in itself. But I think there's the convicting and correcting side of coming together as well. I think so. Yeah. A lot of times we say and I pray this, I'm guilty of praying this, is, may this worship be uplifting to you, and it's not that God needs our worship, right? I think that you're correct in that too, is it's not like God needs our prayer. We pray for our benefit. We worship for our benefit as well. Right. And it's that remembering. And there's a reason why us here, we remember this weekly, because this is something that we should remember, because we easily forget. Humans, we easily forget. So, yeah. 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 Yeah, because I didn't even think about it. I didn't even mention that. We make it a day, right? It has to be a holy day. And I've heard people say, well, if you don't worship on Sunday, well, then you're wrong. And I've heard people say if you don't do a lot of things, then you're going to hell for it, right? Around worship. But if you actually look, when Paul wrote them, I can't remember if it was in Romans where he was like, yeah, you're making one day more important than the other. It doesn't matter, right? And technically they would have worshipped on, I may be saying this wrong. It was either Friday night into Saturday or Saturday night into Sunday. I can't remember when Saturday into Sunday. So a lot of times their worship started on what would have been our Saturday night, which was the start of their Sabbath day, because their day started when the sun set. Yep. Yeah. Go ahead. Seventh day. Yep. Yep. First, and because that was the day that Christ rose from the dead. And so that's why they started worshiping on that day. And again, Sunday's great. It's become the tradition. It's become the norm. And so that's wonderful. But if you have your worship service on a Tuesday afternoon, it doesn't matter as long as you're worshiping God. And so those are the type of things that we need to make sure we don't get caught up. There's nothing wrong with having traditions. There's nothing wrong with having the normal things that you do, for worship. But we've got to make sure we don't make those things become what we're worshiping. Too many, we see churches and organizations, they worship their traditions, they worship their customs more than they worship God. And that's where we've got to make sure we don't get careful. And so finally, and I think this reflects, right, if we look at these four things, Jesus crossing those barriers. So we see that Jesus crosses barriers to reach those who are unlike what the religious world sees. And he meets them in their brokenness, and he redefines worship for them. And through all that, Jesus reveals himself personally. And so this is my favorite. I meant to start this off. This is one of my favorite Bible lessons, right? One of my favorite stories in the Bible. There's one because there's just so many things around it. But Jesus reveals himself personally. But I think this is a perfect example of how us as Christians are to talk and interact and be with the world. Is Jesus' his reaction here and his example here. And so he reveals himself personally. And so the woman said to him, I know the Messiah comes. So this is after talking about how worship's going to be and what it's going to look like and how we're going to worship in spirit and truth. And so the woman, she was smart, right? She was educated. She understood, what he was talking about. And she said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And pay attention because, this is just so important. Then Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. Now, we read that and we skip over it and we think, that's not a big deal. We know that. We know he was. What's interesting about Jesus' ministry, and you can go back and study this, there's only 2 times in the Bible where Jesus said, this is the only time where he says, I am the Messiah. This is the only time. It's the only time he really refers to himself directly as being either the Messiah or God. He uses the word I am a lot in reference to, because he was talking to the Jews to let them know who he was. But the other part, so this is cool to me. So Jesus starts this out early in his ministry, letting this Samaritan woman know that he was the Messiah. The only other time he admits to that is at the end of his ministry when he's about to be crucified, when Pilate, or I can't remember if it was Pilate or one of the Sadducees, I can't remember who it was. I'm sorry, I lost that train of thought. But anyways, when he was being crucified, they asked him, they're claiming that you are the Messiah, and he basically says, I am who they claim. So you have 2 times, one at the very beginning and one at the very end, where Jesus is witnessing and comes out and says, I am this person that you're talking. Now, there's plenty of times where people called him the Messiah and he didn't deny it and stuff like that. But these are the only 2 times where he did that. And he didn't even do it to people who were really considered that important, especially here kicking off his ministry. He was telling in this day, and I'm not trying to be, look down on this woman, but this is just the way the custom was. He's telling some woman, some random strange woman at a well, who the Jews would have rather spit on than talk to, who they literally thought she was because not only a Samaritan, because she was a woman, lower and dirtier than a dog, right? They would have literally, the Jews would have if the 2 of them were drowning, a dog and the Samaritan woman, the Jews would have saved the dog and let her drown. Right? That's what they thought of her. And so here's Jesus talking to her. She's a complete and total outcast. And he's saying, I'm the person. I'm the Messiah. The person that you're talking about, that's who I am. And so Jesus reveals himself personally to 2 people through these white days, through this crossing the lines and through worship, right? And so an outcast becomes the first person to hear Jesus' clearest and greatest revelation. And so Jesus chooses to reveal himself to the least expected. But the thing is, he wants you to know him personally. And so I want us to remember this, because Christianity, in a lot of ways, and a lot of times it's our own fault, we've gotten this bad rap for thinking that we're holier than thou, that we're very self-righteous a lot of times, and we think we're better than everyone out there when we're not. Right? The only difference is that we have Jesus in our life. He's the only thing that makes us better. And so we've got to remember that, but he reveals himself personally to people. And so if we can take this approach to taking Jesus to people, taking Jesus to the world, then I think it's going to make a huge difference in people's lives. Instead of walking up to someone or finding out something about someone when you're talking to them and condemning them or trying to shame them into Christianity, just accept this. Oh yeah, I understand you struggle with that. Or, maybe you get into the discussion of, okay, well, this is what Jesus taught, right? This is what Jesus taught us to be. You look at those type of things and you lovingly present Christ to someone, then that's how we're going to change people. That's how Jesus changed people. Right? He did that with the woman at the well. He did that with the woman who was caught in adultery. Right? He showed them both love and grace and truth. And then after this, and we're not going to read all of it, we're into it, but after he does this, after he tells her that, well, what does she do? She runs into the village. She becomes the first person to preach Jesus, besides Jesus himself. She runs into the village and teaches everyone, or tells everyone about Jesus. And this man who told her everything wrong she had done in her life. I don't know if we got the full extent of the whole conversation, but it was enough to where she saw. And so then many people were converted that day because of what she did. And so we need to remember that. We need to remember that there are no outcasts with Jesus. And I wanted to throw Galatians 3:28. This is kind of beyond the lesson and beyond the scripture that we're studying today. But I wanted us to look at Galatians 3:28. It says, there is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And we need to remember that, right? There's no longer this separation of class or culture or race or anything. When it comes to all of us who are in Christ Jesus, we are all one, and we need to remember that there's no outcast with Jesus. I found this. It says, religion creates outcasts, Jesus makes famous. Right? And so that's who we are. We're a family. And some, even our families sometimes have a little bit of outcast, the black sheep, but we still welcome them in. And so it doesn't matter your past, your mistakes, your reputation. Jesus says you belong to me. You belong with me, so it doesn't matter. None of those things matter. And I understand it's hard, right? It's hard for us as humans to get over sometimes the things we've done, or maybe the things we've said, or the way we've lived our lives sometimes. But Jesus is calling to say, look, I'm forgetting those things. I don't remember those things. And so you don't need to worry about them anymore. You just need to come to me and belong to me. And so my invitation, and what I'm going to do, kind of like we've been doing the last few weeks, is I'm going to invite anyone. If you want to come down, you can come down, but you don't have to. But I think most of us in here are Christians. But if you're not, then I welcome you to come and to learn more about who He is, and to give your life to Him. But if you need prayers, if you need anything, we're going to play a song just in the background, give us time to reflect, to think, and on Jesus, on who He is and what He's done for us. But if you need anything, you're more than welcome to come forward now. And then Helen will close us out in prayer when we're done. Thank you.